complex, one of the most beautiful and productive ecosystems on our planet flourishes in the undersea world of the coral reefs. Coral reefs are the marine equivalent of tropical rainforests, sheltering a complex web of tens of thousands of animal and plant species. Growing at a rate that's barely perceptible, coral reefs form wondrous structures by extracting minerals from seawater. But coral reefs grow only in the clear, sun-drenched waters of the tropics. They are truly living rock in crystal seas. Corals require a bare, hard surface and clean, warm oceanic waters with abundant sunlight to begin to form a reef. Young coral reefs, called fringe reefs, grow close to shorelines. As they mature, fringing reefs develop a seaward edge or forereef, and a back reef and flat, where growth is slower due to sediments and less water flow. Corals can also form barrier reefs, which typically develop along the seaward edge of an offshore shelf and are separated from the shore by a deep lagoon. On the seaward side of the reef, surge channels are formed by wave erosion. Patch reefs are small isolated reef formations that grow inside the outer reefs and are typically surrounded by meadows of seagrass and sandy flats. The oldest coral formations are atolls, rings of coral reef that may form on the tops of seamounts, or as a fringing skirt on the flanks of ancient volcanic islands. Rising sea level or movement of the continental crust, or both, can cause these islands to gradually submerge. As the volcano sinks, the coral reef grows steadily upward to keep within reach of the sun, and gradually develops into an upward growing ring thousands of meters thick. Slower growth in the center of the atoll leads to the formation of a circular reef surrounding a deep lagoon. Barrier and patch reef systems are found in the Florida Keys, which are themselves former reefs.
I'm standing on an ancient coral reef. We call this the Iron Shore Formation. We know that it's a coral reef because you can very clearly see the outline of the polyps here. These are the polyps that laid down the limestone about 100,000 years ago. It's called ironstone because it's as hard as iron. And this comes about because once the limestone is exposed to rain, the rain causes it to recrystallize in a very tough form.
In tropic seas, the coral reef is an oasis. Lush marine gardens found in the midst of vast oceanic deserts, the reef is a unique biological community supporting a wealth of species that find food and shelter within the stony stronghold of its living structure. Embedded within the stony heads and tree-like structures produced by corals of different species are tiny animals called coral polyps. Coral polyps are the most vital part in the intricate web of living organisms and environmental conditions forming the reef ecosystem. The small, individual cup-shaped polyps, about the size of a pencil eraser, are interconnected, forming a colony in which millions of coral polyps live together. Food is shared among the polyps. By day, the polyps are withdrawn into protective cups of limestone. At night, the reef comes alive. Each polyp blooms and extends its stinging tentacles into the water to catch plankton washed over the reef by the changing tides. Just as we absorb calcium from our food to grow bones, the coral polyp absorbs calcium from seawater to build an external skeleton of calcium carbonate or limestone. These skeletons provide a protective shelter into which the polyp can retreat from predators, like butterfly fish and parrotfish that feed directly on corals. The polyps secrete limestone continuously, remaining on the surface as the reef mass grows. The living tissue of the polyp extends from its home to join neighboring polyps. Thus, the surface of the reef is covered with a thin layer of living tissue. A broad range of marine life extracts calcium from seawater. Red and green algae, soft corals, sponges, and many others contribute particles of limestone to build the reef. Amazingly, as much as 90% of the total limestone on a reef may be formed by one kind of algae, Halimeda, whose alkaline surface causes limestone to precipitate out of seawater, producing vast quantities of sand. Over time, these accumulated particles of limestone are fused together. This extends the area of the reef, creating more hard surface where polyps can gain a foothold. Corals grow in oceans all over the world, from the warm waters of the Caribbean to the icy Arctic seas. So why is it reefs of coral form only in warm tropical areas?
Coral reefs are found in the tropics because the tropical species of corals have in their tissues little symbiotic algae that we call zooxanthellae that photosynthesize while they're inside the coral animal and provide the animals with much of their nourishment by these photosynthetic products, which mostly sugars and fats that the algae produce. And the corals use these materials as energy for calcification. So they can produce calcium carbonate, the skeletal material, much faster than corals that live in cold climates. Corals actually live everywhere in the world's oceans, in the deep sea, in the Arctic, but the species in these other areas don't have these algae. Most of them don't, a few do, but most of them don't, and they grow very slowly. Coral reefs are sort of the balance between things that produce calcium carbonate and make the structure of the reef, and both biological and physical forces that break it down. Coral reefs only form when the secretion activities of the secreting animals and algae are higher than the destructive forces. And without these little algae, these zooxanthellae in the coral tissues, they wouldn't be able to grow fast enough to overcome these destructive forces. So these algae are really the secret to why coral reefs occur.
This remarkable symbiotic partnership between animal and plant not only results in the mysterious ability to form reefs, but is also the key to another puzzle: that coral reefs thrive as one of the most productive ecosystems on the planet, even though they exist in the most nutrient-poor waters of the oceans. How can this be? The crystalline waters of the tropics achieve their brilliant clarity because of the lack of nutrients in the water. The warm surface waters don't mix with the colder waters below, and the available supply of nutrients is soon exhausted. The scarcity of vital plant nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus limit the growth of microalgae or phytoplankton, which would cloud the water. How then do the microalgae within the coral polyps thrive? The single-celled zooxanthellae within the coral polyp use photosynthesis to convert carbon dioxide and water into oxygen and carbohydrates, which nourish the coral polyp tissue surrounding them. The coral, like all animals, excretes nitrogen and phosphorus as waste along with carbon dioxide, which in turn nourish the zooxanthellae. So each coral polyp is a microcosm of the global partnership between plants and animals, in which the waste byproducts of each are vital to the existence of the other. This symbiotic nutrient cycling results in high productivity within the reef system. Rivaling the species diversity found in tropical rainforests, coral reef communities flourish as stunning marine gardens in these otherwise ecological deserts. Thus, the success of corals is tied to this extraordinary relationship between coral polyps and their zooxanthellae that exists only under narrow environmental conditions. The water must be warm, between 70 and 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and must flow gently across the reef, bringing in plankton and oxygen and washing away wastes. It must be clear and clean enough for sunlight to reach the zooxanthellae within the coral. The seawater must have moderate salinity and low nutrient levels. Survival and growth of corals depends on the delicate balance of these environmental conditions. But scientists around the world have noticed an alarming decline in coral reefs in the past 3 decades. The causes could be natural or man-made, or a combination of both.
Corals grow very slowly compared to many other organisms. A fast-growing coral grows at a rate of 10 to 15 centimeters per year. Some of the branching corals, that's around 4 to 6 inches per year in length of each branch. But that's exceptionally high. Most corals grow less than 1 centimeter per year. That's less than a half an inch per year in radial growth. So when you see a large coral colony out there that's several feet high, that's probably well over 100 years old. These big massive corals are the redwoods of the underwater world. And unfortunately, whenever you destroy an older, very old animal like this, it's not something that can be replaced very easily or very immediately.
The coral reefs of the Florida Keys have suffered less from overfishing and industrial pollution than some other reefs in the Caribbean. But here the reefs are threatened by overuse and mysterious declines in the clear, clean quality of the water.
Here in the Florida Keys, we have a phrase, we're loving our reefs to death. This is the biggest dive destination in the world. The Florida Keys has roughly 10 times as many divers as the Great Barrier Reef, which has approximately 10 times as much reef as we have here in the Keys. The tourism and commercial fishing industries vie along with the tourists for our resources. And frankly, we're showing the stress. The corals that we have here in the Keys are stressed by a number of factors. The most obvious is the physical impacts of divers standing, touching, and anchoring on the reef.
The Florida Reef Tract is facing a number of problems directly related to human activities. Direct impacts from humans include things such as boat groundings, overfishing, diver damage, such as divers standing on coral, and other diver-related problems. But our research here over the last 12 years indicates that large-scale water quality degradation is the #1 problem facing the future of the Florida Reef Tract.
One area that particularly concerns us is domestic wastewater sources here in the Florida Keys. The Keys is home to over 10,000 illegal cesspits. We have more septic systems than anywhere else in the state, roughly 25,000 in operation today. Add to that the package plants that utilize shallow injection wells for waste, and we have a massive problem. We're here today at the sewage treatment plant for the city of Key West. This plant was built only 3 years ago and designed to carry a capacity of between 6 to 10 million gallons a day. After only 3 years, we're already reaching the maximum 10 million gallons a day, and a new pump is being added to expedite the flow of nutrient-laden water into our nearshore waters. Unfortunately, this plant does not strip the sewage of nutrients, and therefore it is a major contributor to nutrient loading in our nearshore waters.
Our research here at the Harbor Branch Field Station since 1982 has indicated that eutrophication, or nutrient buildup in coastal waters of the Keys, is the #1 problem degrading water quality over a large regional scale. Tropical coral reef and seagrass ecosystems such as we have here in the Florida Keys region are uniquely adapted to very low nutrient conditions under which these ecosystems effectively recycle and conserve nutrients. This characteristic makes these ecosystems very sensitive to even slight increases in external nutrient loads.
There are 80,000 permanent residents in the Florida Keys, and there's an annual visitation of about 4 million people, mostly from the U.S. Now, with that many people basically living and visiting islands, a major issue is what do you do with human sewage? And in the Florida Keys, most often what happens is it is injected into carbonate limestone. It's basically put into groundwaters. And there's increasing evidence, especially in the past 4 or 5 years, that that water, which is heavily laden with nutrients, mainly nitrogen and phosphorus, does enter into nearshore waters, and it impacts seagrass communities as well as nearshore harbor communities. So that is a major issue. There is substantial evidence to indicate that there is nearshore eutrophication in the Florida Keys, but what impact that is having, specifically coastline development on the Florida Reef Tract, is not as well understood. The second geographic area to consider when discussing water quality in the Florida Keys is Florida Bay, and Florida Bay is a shallow water embayment, less than 10 feet. There's been historical diversion of fresh water from the Kissimmee watershed, which basically flows from Lake Okeechobee south. Most of that water has been diverted east into the Atlantic Ocean. So a major issue in Florida Bay has been water quality and where that water goes. Now, historically, for the past several thousand years, Florida Bay water does flow through tidal passes in the middle Florida Keys, and it does reach all the way out to the Reef Tract, which is, again, 5 to 6 miles offshore. So an issue of recent concern is the seagrass die-off in western Florida Bay, and scientists believe that that die-off may be due to increased salinities from freshwater diversion that's been occurring over the past century. Now, the die-off of western Florida Bay has been well documented. If we look at Landsat satellite images from 1976 to 1992, the northwestern part of Florida Bay, you do see a disappearance of seagrasses. But the causes of the seagrass die-off are not well understood, and the impact of Florida Bay water flowing out through the Florida Keys and what effect that has on the Reef Tract is not well understood either.
Each winter since the late 1980s, an explosive growth of algae blooms in Florida Bay, turning the clear waters into a green soup. Some scientists believe that these algae blooms are the single most serious threat to the coral reefs of the Florida Keys. In an attempt to understand the blooms and what causes them, residents of the Keys have joined with state agencies and conservation groups.
Florida Bay Watch is a volunteer program for people who are concerned about water quality, both in Florida Bay and the waters around the Florida Keys. Baywatch was originally conceived of by the fishermen, both commercial fishermen and recreational fishermen like bone fishermen, because they're the ones who were out here in Florida Bay every day on their boats fishing. They were seeing the changes that were happening in the bay. They saw the water get murky, they saw the seagrass die, and they were very upset. They knew that if somebody didn't do something, then they would lose their livelihood. They originally approached the South Florida Water Management District and said, we would really like to help. We're out there in our boats every day. Couldn't we do something? Couldn't we take a water sample? And the Water Management District said, what a great idea. But they turned to the Nature Conservancy to organize the program because Nature Conservancy has a history of volunteer programs. And Nature Conservancy now organizes Baywatch, but we do receive funding from South Florida Water Management District, from EPA, from Everglades National Park, and in-kind support from the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary. The project that we're out on the water here today is a joint project with the Florida Marine Research Institute. Once a month, we send a plane up over Florida Bay, and the scientists in the plane are making a map of the different colors of water that they can see from the plane. Then based on that information, the scientists decide where they would most like to have a water sample, and I match that up with what volunteers I have available, and then the volunteers go out in their boats and take water samples out here. We have a whole assortment of volunteers. Baywatch started a year ago, and I started out with 7 volunteers, and now I have 128, and I have student groups, I have retirees, I have people with science backgrounds, I have people with no background, I have mortgage bankers, construction workers, lawyers, nuclear engineers, a whole variety of volunteers. The volunteers for this project go out and they take a sample that is processed for fresh algae. That sample, when it goes back to the lab, will be analyzed for the species of algae, the relative abundance. They'll look at how much of the sample is sediment versus how much is living matter.
There we go. A little grass, but we don't need that. Just keep us from getting
Wow,
the hydrometer.
look at the color of that water.
Really bad today.
That is a dark pea green. I know this has got to be the heart of the algae bloom in this area.
Well, it's the worst I've seen. Even down 9 Mile Bank is not near as bad as this.
Looks like 1.019. Correction factor is plus 0.004. Temperature is 30 degrees centigrade.
30 degrees centigrade. Okay.
Really bad looking water today, Fran.
I know, you could see the color of the water right there
Yeah.
in the bucket. Then the volunteers use a hydrometer to measure the specific gravity. They take the temperature and the specific gravity reading will give them salinity. They use a Secchi disc to measure the water clarity, or how turbid the water is. They are also writing down wind and weather and current observations.
Let me tell you the significance of the colors on this map from January 16th, 1995. First of all, in the Central Bay was this huge area of these yellow-green colors, this darker yellow-green and then yellow-green, and that typically signifies an area of very high microalgae concentrations. And in this particular instance, we had chlorophyll levels of about 14 micrograms per liter, which is about 14 times higher than what you should find in the clear waters of the Florida Keys. We've had at other times levels as high as 40 micrograms per liter inside this region. And during the winter, this area is very large. And on this particular day, and for some time before that, sometime after, you can see that it even pulsed out through the passes in the Keys, out into the ocean south of the Keys, and in fact, down in this region, covered the coral reefs, 5-6 miles offshore.
These harmful algal blooms can directly smother corals, as in the case of macroalgae, that overgrow and physically smother the corals. Or it can be in the form of microscopic phytoplankton in the water column, which gives the water a green hue, attenuates light, so it's reducing the amount of light that the coral needs for its proper maintenance and respiration, and also increases the sedimentation. These microscopic algal cells are sedimenting out of the water column onto the corals, and this fosters diseases such as black band disease and white band disease that directly kill the adult corals.
I think the main problem in Florida Bay is the algae bloom. And although water quality problems in the Florida Keys are having a negative effect on benthic communities near the Keys, I don't think that the nutrients from the Florida Keys are fueling the algae bloom in Florida Bay proper. I think this is more of a Florida Bay problem, which could be coming from within the bay or from directly or indirectly be related to alteration of the water flow out of the Everglades, whether it be from high salinity levels causing death of seagrasses and this releasing nutrients into the water column, or water that is discharged into the bay being loaded with nutrients from agricultural runoff.
For many years, scientists and water managers alike have believed that the problems in Florida Bay, such as algal blooms and seagrass die-off, resulted from high salinity due to reduced freshwater flow through the Everglades. Our research over the past several years has shown that the changes that are occurring in Florida Bay are not a result of high salinity, but rather hypereutrophication, which is the result of nutrient loads coming both through the Everglades, down the west coast of Florida, and from the Florida Keys from wastewater nutrient sources. Part of the misconception that's been made by water managers and many scientists working with Everglades National Park is that the Everglades is a big filter that filters all the nutrients out. We know from published scholarly research by a variety of different scientists that this is not the case, certainly not for nitrogen. And the high levels of nitrogen that are coming into Everglades National Park increase as you move upstream towards the Everglades agricultural area. The actual source of the nitrogen likely results from sources including fertilizers that may be used on vegetable crops in the Everglades agricultural area, but more likely due in large part to topsoil loss or subsidence of topsoil through oxidation processes that leaches nitrogen out of the black muck that's farmed for sugarcane and other crops in the Everglades agricultural area. I hope that the research that we've done here at Harbor Branch since 1982 has served to draw attention to the need to guide restoration efforts for the South Florida coastal margin ecosystem on a holistic scale that extends from roughly Orlando south through Lake Okeechobee, the Everglades, Florida Bay, and out to the Florida Reef Tract, that this entire South Florida ecosystem is linked and integrated.
Again, it's very complicated, and there are people that feel that the whole Caribbean basin is nutrient polluted, that it's not the question of looking to the nearby development, and that because of all the deforestation of Central America and the increase in nutrients and agriculture activities in the Mississippi River Valley, that these major rivers are delivering to the whole Caribbean basin and the Atlantic nearshore huge amounts of nutrients and sediment that are killing the reefs on a very broad scale. And that, of course, is a scary thing to think about, because people really haven't been looking too much at that kind of scale.
Scientists don't all agree on what is causing the decline of Florida reefs. The problems may be local, regional, or global. They may be natural or man-made. What is certain is that any of us can be part of the solution.
I believe that coral transplanting is a viable way to heal areas that have been damaged. And this is, without exception, the largest community of pillar corals that I've seen in the entire Florida Reef Tract. And we had a lot of damage here at this particular site from Hurricane Andrew because of the bioerosion at the base of the reef. And what we've done is come out and restore a lot of these pillars, a lot of the large colonies that have been toppled. We've uprighted them with airbags. They've been cemented back in place, and the individual pillars that were broken off, we've drilled holes in the bare reef rock and cemented these pillars back into the reef. So it's really gratifying to do this kind of work.
Coral reefs have been on the Earth for 500 million years. What they need to survive is the same thing needed in the wetlands, estuaries, and rainforests of the Earth: a balance of nurturing elements. If we can understand this complex balance, we will always have living rock in crystal seas.